time. So let's do this. We are ready. So hello, everyone. Welcome to this last roundtable of the day. My name is Bree. I am the host of Pontifex, but I am not here to talk about popes right now. I am your admin for this wonderful session. So, a few technical things up top. And so with that, I will introduce the wonderful Greta, who's going to take charge.
So welcome to our Contingencies for Women panel. The premise here is that in most of Western history, you pretty much, unless you had a man of some sort, you were up a creek without a paddle to help unless you had a man to help you interface with society. You had no sort of like person credentials without one. So father, brother, husband, son, uncle, cousin, brother-in-law, etc., etc., etc. Unfortunately, it didn't always go that way for all women. In fact, many women. So I have with me Lori Davis of her Half of History podcast and Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength and my other ridiculous podcast, Prize Fighters,
amazingly ridiculous.
Yes. Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters, which is a ludicrous look at the history of the 19th century that we make a mess of. And so I've invited both of them on to share some of the paths that women without men in their lives took, despite the fact that they shouldn't have been able to survive. So Lori, please start us off.
All right. Well, we are going to start with the most mundane, the least exciting option, but probably also one of the most common, and that is laundry. So laundry has been around as long as clothes have been around for millennia, right? But there mostly aren't sources. You know, laundry was for illiterate women to do, so they weren't writing about it. You know, the people who were writing things down weren't even mentioning it because they were hiring it out to, you know, women who could do it, either hiring a woman who wasn't related or just having the women you are related to do it. So I'm going to skip right through. There are a few scattered references, but I'm going to skip, in the interest of time, right to the 19th century where we do start having actual sources. And that is because at this point in history, there is enough of a middle-class literate women's market that you can have a market for books on how to be a good housewife, you know, how to take care of your home. And most of these books are really a you got this, girl, you can do it kind of thing, except when they talk about laundry. What they say when they talk about laundry is you really don't got this, and how about you just hire someone else to do it? That's really what they have to say, because it is the worst of the tasks. Now, obviously, not everyone can hire it out, but enough of them could that there's a market, right? So if you are a woman who needs income, this is one of your options, okay? So there are kind of two different paths to doing it in the 19th century. Yes, I see in the chat, it is still the worst of tasks. Yes. However, now, you know, when I do it, it's just like dump it all in and press a couple of buttons. It was a lot worse. So in the 19th century, at least, there are two potential ways to do it. So if you're, you know, young, you've never been married, you don't have an establishment, then probably what you do is you go around to the larger houses or even middle-class houses, and you offer your services and you come into their house to do the laundry. If you are maybe, say, a widow and you have children, then you may be doing it in your own home, your own establishment, and you're probably using your children as your delivery people. Like they go out and they collect a bag of dirty clothes and they bring it to you, and when you're done, you take it back. The actual process of doing the laundry is intense because, you know, there's no running water. So if you follow, so the historian Susan Strasser has looked into some of the instructions given in these household manuals of the 19th century. And even to do one load of laundry, like for your own family, you are hauling 400 pounds of water. You have to bring it in. You have to drain it afterwards. You also have to heat it up because the main process is you let it soak overnight and then you boil it. You might boil it twice, with suds. There's all kinds of different products by this point that they can have, which was an improvement because in previous generations, the two basic products are lye, which is water soaked through wood ashes. That is a cleaning agent, but it's also caustic. And yes, I see in the chat you're anticipating me. The second major one that you have is urine, aged urine. It has ammonia. So by the 19th century, when you can actually buy some soap, you're like, yeah, this is the life. It's getting better, right? Okay. But it is still a gargantuan task. Honestly, in one of the manuals, it even recommends burning brimstone underneath it to dry. So, I mean, you're like, this is literally hell. It is hell because you're burning brimstone. That's what she recommends you do. So this lasts as an option for women because everybody needs it. Everybody needs it. And it lasts for really quite a long while. The very first patent for a washing machine was in the 18th century, but they mostly don't exist. It's just on paper, right? And even that, it's really just a device to help you churn. You still have to haul the water. You still have to drain the water. You still have to stir it. It's not until the beginning of the 20th century that there's any help on that subject. And at the beginning of the 20th century, there are still women who are doing this as their full-time job, because even women who are doing their own housework, that was a phrase that meant you couldn't afford a live-in maid because domestic servants have become much more expensive as women have other options, like in factories or offices. Doing your own housework still meant you had a woman coming in twice a week to do the laundry because you weren't doing the laundry. And that lasts really until, I mean, it depends on where you are, obviously, but in the United States, it lasts really until after World War II, when more and more women started to have the option of having their own washing machine, not necessarily a dryer, but their own washing machine in their home, or at least maybe they could go to a laundromat. And this is kind of interesting for women's contingency plans because, you know, that gradual period where there's less and less of the laundry, it coincided with other opportunities for single women, you know, more and more office jobs, more and more things like that. But for married women, not really so much. Like married, you know, we're talking about contingencies, widowed women, I guess is what I mean, with children where you can't just leave them all day. There weren't necessarily other options to just fill into that slot of something that you could do at home to pay the bills. And I think that may be where I will pass it off to another contingency plan.
Okay, so we have finished up the mundane. Let's go to Jamie. Make sure you're unmuted. If you were in the 19th century, and you were without a man to interface between the world, what could you do if you didn't want to be a laundress?
So this actually is probably the high point for 19th century women in terms of what they could do, because a 19th century woman could get a manager and then be basically free to travel. And I mean, that manager could make all of the contracts and everything for that person. Now, basically, if you're thinking about modern athletes or actresses, well, actresses have a different path now, but it was all kind of one convoluted thing. If you were an athlete, you would have to either sing or act or play an instrument. There would have to be something that you would add to your performance as a general rule in order to have a draw on vaudeville or in the circus. Think like Pink having somebody singing while somebody's standing on their stomach. That sort of thing was really common in vaudeville. And so when you had a talent that like this, or like riding a circus horse or something along those lines, you could get a manager and then that person could enter the contracts for you. So it worked out better. The goal at the end, the kind of the brass ring for everybody that they were trying to grasp, if you were an athlete, whether male or female, was owning a bar. That was the brass ring. If you owned a bar, or it would be a bar and grill, you would have a ready source of income. You would have an ability to interact with your fan base that would also leave you an extra income because you're drawing in these people by still doing a little bit of a performance here and there. And I would say the best person to use as an example of this is a woman named Sandwina, who was named such. She was a Jewish woman whose name was Katie Brumback, but she took the name Sandwina after she defeated the greatest bodybuilder on planet Earth at the time, Eugen Sandow, at a lifting competition. She outlifted him with one hand, and as basically her title was Sandwina, the woman who defeated Sandow. And to give you an idea of how important this man is to modern bodybuilding, the statue that is given to a winner of the Mr. Olympia now is the Sandow. And this woman beat him. So basically what she did was she had parents who were performers, and so she had the support system. But I'm giving her as an example of the best case scenario. She was able to defeat every man she ever encountered in wrestling, and eventually met a man she really liked, let him beat her at wrestling, and married him. He became her manager, and they traveled and performed together, and they were in love with each other throughout their lives, and ended up having a beautiful bar that they ended in Queens, had a nice life. She died of cancer at an old age, and it was nice. There were other examples of women who were actually separated from any kind of like family support. And those women would, again, have to get a manager who they typically married. And so that kind of lifeline was there, and they could operate on their own as a woman by themselves. In which case they just replaced their manager with a gun, which they would use to collect the money from anybody who owed them money at the end. But they had to have a gun to replace their manager, otherwise they would not get paid. And the one very good example I have of this is a woman who started as a strong woman and then became a trapeze. Well, she became a pedestrian, then a trapeze artist. Then she went into competitive cycling, and her name was Luis Armando. She beat horses, men, and women at racing, the best racer on the planet. And she ended up dying because she had to nail her windows shut at night because she didn't travel with a man. She had no protection. So she had to lock and bar her door and nail her windows shut in a hotel at night. And the hotel caught fire, and she ended up getting horribly burned and injured trying to jump out of the hotel when she finally wrestled the window open. But women had great options, and they were basically, the world was their oyster. They could travel wherever they wanted when they had a manager.
All right. Well, we've got the mundane, we've got the fantastical, and then I'm going to take us on the middle way. So if you didn't want to be a laundress because, oh my God, that sounds like so much hard work, and you were untalented and didn't have any singing, dancing, sword fighting, or horse riding skills, probably because you were raised on the farm and were probably pretty strong, another option was to go to war. Now, some of these women went to war somewhat by choice, either because the man that they had married became a soldier, or they decided to follow him when he was conscripted, or they just wanted to get off the farm. There were also a fair number of these women who entered into the war following life less voluntarily. They might have been on a farm that was invaded or burned out, or just the turmoil in their country meant that where they were living was no longer viable. And so they'd pick up and join the colony of women that followed soldiers. Now, typically we sort of see them written about called camp followers. And for a long time, that has come to mean that these women were prostitutes, and jokes on them, laundresses a lot of the time. So there was definitely going to be some laundry involved. You gotta wash those socks and shirts occasionally, because otherwise your soldiers are just going to rot away from their extremely dirty clothes and too many lice all at the same time. But these women performed an astounding number of tasks following along, and it was very common that they would attach themselves to one soldier, possibly again coming into the war following life as the spouse or girlfriend of a soldier. But if your man dies, you gotta find another protector now. So these women might move through men as their protectors as they went along the way, or they would become merchants, laundresses, or sex workers all on their own. It was very common for these women to sort of work as temporary merchants. They would sort of go ahead to where a camp was headed, set up a shop along the way, and sell them chickens or beer or spirits or, extra socks. So all of these different ways that women could move through life, whether as laundresses or as performers or as part of this campaign community, before we get into the sort of the modern age, it was very typical to shift around from one job to the next job to the next job. So Laura, I was going to ask you were sort of talking about kind of late 19th and early 20th century laundry. How would laundress sort of work in earlier times? Was it always out for pay or what?
Oh, not necessarily. Like I said, in most societies, we just don't know how it was done because nobody bothered to write it down. But we do, for example, have some records from the Roman Empire. There were professional laundries there that do actually seem to have been staffed by men. I'm all about men doing laundry. That's fantastic. Unfortunately, they were probably enslaved men, so that's not great. But we know about this in partly because it's mentioned in some places, but also because you can see the engineering. They had all kinds of pools with different levels so that the water could be drained out. They even had some places where the public urinals could drain the urine directly into the laundry. But those aren't necessarily women's contingency plans, right? Because that's not what it is. And I seriously doubt that, not everyone in the empire was doing it that way, right? There were undoubtedly women doing it on their own. In a rural area, the easiest way you do it is you actually go stand in the stream or the river or whatever it is that you have. The hauling became actually more of a problem when you live in an urban environment and you don't have a river right there for you to just go stand in. Of course, you can't control the water temperature if it's a river. There are also some places in Europe where there was like a public service. They built some structures, sometimes even covered, where there were multiple basins standing next to each other, and women would come out from the community, it's right next to the river, and use those basins together. So in some ways, it was sort of a social experience. I mean, it's not fun work, but you're not doing it alone in your house. You're doing it with the other women in the community. And so I can imagine that would have helped a little, right? You're gossiping with your friend while you do it.
Very cool. Well, it looks like
a bit more like a modern laundromat, right?
Yeah, a little bit more, just a lot more work and weather concerns and yeah.
So it looks like we've got a few questions. Bree, do you want to share those with us?
Sure, I can pop on for that. So the first question that we had was, how does dry cleaning play into this? How does that change the contingencies for women?
Yes. So the rise of commercial laundries, and they're not necessarily dry cleaning. There was also steam cleaning and, various other methods. They kind of rise in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the US and also in Britain. In the US, they were particularly associated with Chinese immigrants. It was one of the few industries that they were allowed to work in. So the Chinese laundry was a thing. What that means, I mean, that's good for the women who work in such a place. It's bad for the women who are trying to run it as their contingency plan. But if you were able to leave your home, like you didn't have children and stuff that you needed to watch out for, it became an additional place to work. And in fact, even just last night while researching something else, I was reading an advice column for girls in Britain in the late 19th century. And a girl wrote in about maybe getting a job as a shop assistant. And the advice that the editor wrote to her was, well, you could do that, but I'd recommend you go work in a commercial laundry instead, because you can only be a shop assistant as long as you're young and pretty. But laundry, that's a career that can last your whole life.
Oh,
wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, it's really depressing. to think about it.
At what age would you have aged out of being a shop lady?
You know, that I don't know. I don't know.
Interesting.
All right.
I know you've answered this in text, but just for the sake of conversation, Greta, you were asked by Robert Jan if you've read Monstrous Regiment by Terry Pratchett, because this is very much, that is a whole book based on females going to war, and in a very socially commentary sort of way. If you love this stuff, you should definitely read it.
Okay, now I'm even more excited. I'm like, I don't know anything about it. I love it. But that definitely it refers, there's that quote about the monstrous regiment of women, and it was an anti-social reformer going, these women with their opinions and all that talking.
Robert also left a comment to say, also to combine what was said about pubs and women at war, there is a story of a woman soldier in the English Civil War, Black Bess by name, who supposedly bought a pub by her comrades when she retired, and the pub bore her name.
Oh.
So
Yeah, I've not heard of that pub, but it sounds awesome. All of those old pubs too had such character. So I'm sure if that pub still exists, there is a cast of some part of that lady's body on the wall or something. I know it was a really big thing for athletes back in those days. Like if anybody who owned the bar would have their arm cast flexing, and they're all sticking out of the wall. So you can actually like kind of touch the person from the past, and it's a little less morbid than a death mask. So Sanduina would have had that in her bar, actually.
Oh my goodness, that is so much fun. And I wonder how many of these women who went on to become strong women started out as laundresses hauling all of that water.
Yeah, building up those guns.
Yeah, well, it wasn't trivial. I mean, nothing about the weaker sex here. It was heavy work.
Yeah, water is heavy, and wet clothes are heavy.
Yes. Exhausting.
What was the mode of conveyance for this 400 pounds of water? Because moving water is not easy in any situation, but they didn't have paved roads. Like, right. How are they moving it, with buckets?
Well, it depends. I mean, sometimes buckets. In some urban environments, you went down to the pump and you actually had to pump it. You might be going out to your well. You might be setting up your where you're doing it right next to the well, so you don't have to carry it. In some community, actually still in some communities, what you do is you send the kids. Kids can carry water.
Kids can carry lots of things.
Yeah. I mean, they'll spill a lot of it, but
water carrying they can do.
Yeah.
So branching right onto that in terms of the strength that it would need, PETA asks, do we know how much about the effects of laundry work on the health of women?
So there is definitely some. So when your hands are in and out of hot and cold water all day, every day, when you're using these chemicals, I mean, lye is caustic. If it's in a strong thing, they don't have the soft on the hands, tough on grease kind of stuff. So yes, there is definitely, it's throughout the literature from the very beginning of any mentioning that laundresses are prone to red, swollen, chapped, infected hands. And yeah, I mean, it's an occupational hazard for sure.
Yeah, just from the science side of it, when you say caustic, what that means is it's able to dissolve the fattiness in your cells and tissues. And so it breaks down the integrity of your skin cells. It just...
And that's exactly what makes it good as a cleaner, right? It's breaking down the grease and the chemicals that have gotten into your clothes, but it's not fun to touch.
Well, it didn't in Fight Club, he kisses his hand and then pours lye on his hand and gives him a chemical burn, and that's like his wake-up call to like he's part of the Fight Club thing. So you actually, for anybody who's seen Fight Club, you see a chemical burn in action from lye. It was yeah, and that was being a laundress, chemical burns.
Yeah, and they would also have like lung troubles from all of like the caustic steam that they were inhaling too.
Yeah, undoubtedly.
I was literally about to say, time to learn to sing, but no, you can't, because your lungs are burned with lye. So, and your face is probably pitted and burned from lye. Right. So yeah, vaudeville is probably not an option after being a laundress for very long.
Not to mention the absolute degradation of your joints and the arthritis you would have from the constant repetitive motion and the carrying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm sure being a strong woman probably had physical impacts as well, right?
So when I say strong woman, these people were all like very, very multi-sport athletes. Like Louise Armando, who I mentioned, started out as a strong woman, and wasn't just a strong woman. She was the daughter of a circus strong woman and a man who was a Canadian voyager, which is a guy who sells furs at like in remote areas and things like that. And he used to do prize fights where he'd fight groups of people at a time. He was a huge man. And like, so these two huge people had this woman who wasn't very big, but she was very strong, but she couldn't make any money as a strong man or a strong woman because it was really like a second stage act. So it was very low on the totem pole. So they all bounced around with different stuff, trying to like add singing or add comedy. A lot of them did comedy in order to like get to where they were going. But the injuries often came from trapeze work, because the trapeze, when it was invented in the late it was really invented in the early 18th century. It didn't, or early 19th century, early 1800s in Germany. And then when it got to the United States, they were putting it in acts where people were doing crazy triple somersault stunts with no net underneath. And so they would just fall to their death, because they would have a spotter or something who would try to catch them. And if they didn't catch them, they would fall to their death. Or there were women, one of them, Leona Dare, used to hang from a hot air balloon, and she would hold a trapeze in her teeth and hang by her teeth like hundreds of feet off the ground. And then she eventually, of course, was crippled and then later died from her injuries from falling from these hot air balloons. So it was that, or stunts that went bad, like anytime they tried to do a support with a car driving over them, those often ended, as you can imagine, with people dying, because cars would stop and start. They would stall on top of this human bridge and then collapse on top of the person, and they would be horribly injured. So
you're starting to make laundry look good, right? Like laundry probably isn't going to kill you. I mean,
but laundry wouldn't get you the only Pullman car a woman owned in the United States. That was owned by the woman with the best biceps in America. So,
well, that is true. You're not going to get rich or famous off of laundry. In fact, I looked up like famous laundresses. Google doesn't have anything to say on that subject.
Yeah, the only fame I know about laundries is the ones that were used as punishments for naughty women who had children in affairs out of wedlock.
There you go. You definitely need a contingency plan.
Coming back to the strong women for a minute, I'm curious how much overlap there is with the idea of the freak show, because we know historically, if you were othered in a community, a freak show might be one of the only places in which you could have a community and be financially supported or have some sense of stability at this period in time. Do we see a lot of overlap with strong women?
Not there were a couple of the only real overlap there was people who would catch cannonballs. That was kind of the crossover between freak shows and strong women, and mostly that was a male dominated thing. So I can think of one or two women who did it in the past, but they were kind of women strongmen were all, or strong women were often discredited because they would do lifts that were not quite, there was a bit of trickery involved. So when they would do a cannonball thing, it was typically something similar. Like there was no gunpowder involved. It was spring loaded. The spring was weak. They were catching a light ball, something. So there was a lot of questions around what they would do. And that really wasn't due to the fact they were female. It was due to the fact that a lot of strong men, strong women of that era did those things. And in fact, one of the most popular strong women of the era, Volcana, she was the good lifter of the pair. Her husband and manager was the lifter who used hollow globe barbells and things like that. And so her lifts ended up being called into question as a result of his nonsense lifts.
Right. So we have about, go ahead.
I was going to say, we're coming to the end, and I just wanted to sort of wrap up with this idea. And I very specifically called out that in Western history, this is particularly a problem for women, because it doesn't have to be this way. And in a lot of parts of the world, it wasn't. And there are still parts of the world where it isn't. Just because you don't have a man to interface with you between, you and personhood, basically, there are plenty of societies that did it other ways. And when the Europeans came over to the Americas, one of the things that they noticed and were confused by is that all of the land, or in most societies, the land was actually owned by the women. And it really confused them as to like how this could happen. Or like when we were doing working with pemmican up in the northern areas, all of the pemmican that the women made, that was their personal property because they had made it. So there are a lot of societies and there are a lot of ways of arranging your civilization that when a particular human being bites the dust through war, misadventure, or old age, they don't leave a bunch of other people behind. So it's just very interesting to see that there was this problem created and all of these different ways women went through solving that problem. And we've just got a couple of minutes left if you want to wrap it up or anybody has any thoughts on that.
Well, just if I could circle back to the freak show thing, one of the things that was huge for women who were performers at this time was their sex appeal, and the freak show aspect would have completely undermined the sex appeal.
Yeah.
So they're really, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination a historian of freak shows, but to my recollection, I think that would have been counterproductive for most women.
Yeah, there's certainly a social ideology around the otherness of freak shows. So it was very much, if you were being a part of that, it was an exclusive community because you were excluded from the community.
Yeah, no, strong women were part of the same community that was gamblers, prostitutes, athletes, actors, lay physicians. All of it was because they often traveled with lay physicians who would do tooth pulling and stuff like that, and then would perform as it was like modern TV. The actors and strongmen would be the performers, and then they would have commercials that the doctors would pull teeth or sell some kind of patent medicine and things like that. And so that was another way that women were easily hacks. They were hacks, but they were charlatans. That's where the word comes from, in fact. And strong women and strong men and actors and things like that always traveled with those people.
Final thoughts, Lori?
Okay, just to say, laundry was one textile related career, but another was seamstress, right? Because even worldwide, Greta talked about how it was this way in Western society, which was true. But one thing that seems to be almost universal when you look around is that women are in charge of the textiles. Whatever the textile actually is, women are in charge of it. And so another option would be to sew, which is also very hard work, but maybe a little bit better than the laundry.
A little easier on the hands.
Yes. Not so much on the eyes necessarily. They did complain about that.
Mm-hmm. So
it's
with
funny,
that,
lye doesn't seem to be good for any part of your body. It's bizarre, It's
who would have thought?
It's almost like it's bad for every part of it.
Yeah.
So with that, we're at about the 5-minute mark. So any final questions can roll in, or we can wrap it here because it's the last one of the day. We've covered this very thoroughly. I think it's been wonderful. Final thoughts have been said. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for being here. Thank you, Greta, Jamie, and Lori. You've done a fantastic job.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody who's here right now for watching this. We'll see you at the keynote.
Yes.
Thank you very much
and
for inviting us.
And the after party.
And the after party. All right. See you, everybody. Bye.
All right.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.